So now that we understand how this content ends up on the screen here and how this app component got loaded onto the screen, therefore, it's time to work towards that demo application that we want to build throughout this section and to therefore learn more about Angular and all its features. And if we take a look at the finished demo application here, it's probably fair to say that we could split this up into multiple components, multiple UI building blocks. For example, we have this header here. We then have this sidebar where every element could be treated as a separate component, a separate HTML element. We have this area on the right here. If we click on Add Task, we got this dialog open up here, which could also be considered a separate component. So in short, we got a bunch of building blocks here that make up the overall UI. And when working with Angular, the idea is to build those building blocks as individual components and to then compose them together to get the overall UI. And therefore, here, to get started with those essentials, but also with this application, we could get started by building this header component here as a first step. And the question therefore now, of course, is how do we do that? Well, we already have a component in this application, the app component. So the main component of this application, the only component that we have on the screen right now. And what we can see here is that this component is actually made up of 3 files that are working together. And indeed, that's pretty much the standard in Angular. You create components as separate files, and it's typically multiple files working together that form an overall component. So if we wanted to add a header component for our demo application here, we would typically do that by adding a new file, a header.component.ts file, for example. And I'm saying for example because the exact naming is up to you, but this is the common convention and pattern you'll see in most Angular projects. That you have a file name that starts with a name that identifies the component you're building, so a name that describes what the job of this component will be. It will be a header in this case, so that sounds like a fitting name. Then you have a dot, and then you describe what will be stored in this file. And in this case, it will be a component, so it's dot component. Later, you will learn that in Angular, you can also build other things than components, which is why we have this identifier in the file name. Well, and then we have this extension .ts, because like all the code we're going to write as Angular developers, it will be TypeScript code that lives in that file. Though up to this point, we haven't really seen any TypeScript specific features except for that decorator yet. That will change later, but indeed very often TypeScript code is just JavaScript code, because it builds up on that. So we have this file, and now in that file, we need such a class. Because components in Angular are classes that are enhanced by that component decorator. Therefore, in the header component.ts file, we should start by exporting a new class, and it must be exported so that it can be used in other files as well. And the name of that class should now be header component. Again, not for technical reasons, you could name it whatever you want, but again, the convention is that you have a name that starts with an identifier of the thing you're building. So in this case, describing what the component will be about. It will be about displaying a header, so that sounds like a fitting name. And then you have a description of what the job of this class will be. In this case, it will be a class that will define a component, but as you will also learn later, there also are other kinds of classes you can build in Angular that will define different things than components. But here, it's a header component, and then you need opening and closing curly braces to define the class body. And just as for the app component, it will stay empty for now. That will change later for some of our components, but here for this header component, it will stay empty. Then, in order to convert this to a component, we need to import this component decorator from the Angular framework and there from the core package. And then it must be added by adding this add symbol, then the name of the decorator, component in this case, and then by adding parentheses, opening and closing. And then between those parentheses, we pass a configuration object just as we saw it on this app component. And now here, for our first custom component, the header component, we again have to define a selector that will tell Angular which elements on the screen should be controlled by our own component, or should be replaced by our own component, you could say. And here the convention is to select elements by tag and to select elements by a tag that consists of at least 2 words separated by a dash. For example, app-header. The reason for that is that if you would choose just one word, you could clash with built-in elements. For example, there is a built-in header element in HTML. And with that kind of component, we would be overriding the default header with our own custom component all the time, and that's probably not what we want. Hence, it should be app-header. Now, this prefix here is up to you. App is a common choice, but it could be my app, it could be your name, whatever you want. I'll go for app. And with that, we have a selector that selects elements that should be replaced by our header component. Then, as I also explained before, you also always need a template, which defines the markup, the content that should be displayed by that component. Now, you could set up a template by adding a template property like this, and then you could set up the template as a string right inside of this component.typescript file, like this. That would work. But this is actually not a recommended way of defining a template. You should only use this inline approach where you do it inside of this TypeScript file if you have super simple short templates that only consist of 1 or 2 or maybe 3 lines of code. If you have more complex templates, or simply in general, it is recommended that you use an external HTML file at which you point with help of the template URL property in that configuration object. And then this wants a string that contains the relative path seen relative from this TypeScript file to the file that contains the markup for this component. At the moment, I don't have such a file yet, but we can of course add one. And again, the convention is to basically repeat the name of the TypeScript file, so header.component, but now, since it will contain markup, it should end with .html. And now you would link to that file from inside the TypeScript file by defining that relative path, which in this case, since they're in the same folder, means that the path is // to make it clear that it's a relative path, and then just the file name, header.component.html. With that, we can then put our markup into this external HTML file. And here I'll, for example, use the standard header element. So that's the one built into the browser. It's not my custom component or anything like that. And then I'll just add a h1 tag for now with a text of easy task. That could be the name of the demo app we're building. We'll add more content to this markup later. For the moment, that's all I want here. Now with that, our component is almost done, but we can add more. For example, some styles, though I'll get back to that in a second. What we should add right now already, though, is another important configuration property. And that's the standalone property, which should be set to true. Though I will say that depending on the Angular version you're using, this might be set to true automatically. To be precise, if you're working in a project that uses Angular 19 or higher, this will be true by default, and you therefore don't need to set this property. You can omit it. And you should check your package.json file to find out which Angular version you're using in your project. Now, if you're using a version lower than 19, you must set this to true because false would be the default there, and we don't want that. We want that to be true, because this set to true is the modern way of building Angular components. And you can use that modern way with Angular 18 as well. The rest of the component will be the same. You just need to set standalone to true. But with higher Angular versions, you don't even need to do that. That's just important to note. Here, I'll set it to true so that it will work in either version. Because if you're setting this to true in Angular 19 or higher, that of course also won't be a problem. You wouldn't need to do it there, but it of course creates no problem if you do explicitly set it to true there. Now, this property marks this component as a so-called standalone component. And Angular also knows other types of components. For example, module-based components, which you would get if you set standalone to false. Now, these different component formats exist for historic reasons, because in the past, Angular only knew module-based components, but then it introduced standalone components, where this is set to true, which are simply a bit easier to use and tie together. For the moment, that's all you need to know. Later, I'll have a separate section where I dive deeper into module-based components and the difference to standalone components, since many projects out there still use this old component format. It is, however, the recommendation nowadays to work with standalone components, so to set this to true, and that's therefore what we will do here as well. Well, and with that, we now prepared this header component. The question now just is, how do we use it?